computer, I guess. Okay, looks like we're good to go. All right. Well, welcome everybody. Let's get our PDFs up. Uh, so, I think I might share my screen just for ease of reference. I guess I would say a few things. So what I typically like to have you guys do is do your best job at summarizing what you just read in just a few words. Now, this is the first time that we've met in this capacity, Justin, so I don't expect you to be able to do that right now. There is a lot going on, although just in a certain respect, it's also quite simple because all Deleuze is doing here is giving a summary of his understanding of a particular method that Bergson uses. He calls it the method of intuition. And so we'll want to get clear, and it's actually quite nice the way he sets it up here. This is actually from Bergson himself. Bergson sets it up this way, that there are basically like 3 steps to the method. And so that's a really nice, convenient way to start a summary of this kind of thing. Just what are the steps, what's involved in the steps. And then there are a lot of details and a lot of terminology that Deleuze leaves undefined, expects you just to know, because he expects that you've written a doctoral dissertation on Bergson as well. So, you know. I guess we could also say a few things about the history of what's going on here in terms of the history of thought, different ideas in the history of philosophy, how Bergson compares to people that were writing around the same time, his relationship to the history of Western philosophy, and then Deleuze's own position and situation with respect to that history. So we can say a few things there.
Yeah, that sounds like a good place to start.
Yeah, okay, well, Sand, take it away. So we've talked a few times. I mean, first of all, we've been meeting, what, I don't know, 2 years now or so. And so you've gotten a fair amount of background in the history of philosophy. And so there should be a few basic things that you could say about the sort of project that Bergson is engaged in, and in particular how it relates to some of the other maybe more dominant trends in Western philosophy. So you want to say what you remember about that? And in particular, it has to do with this idea of process ontology. That's not Bergson's own term. That is the way that the English philosopher Whitehead described what he did as process philosophy, process and not substance philosophy. So what's the difference between process ontology and substance ontology?
Yeah. So, well,
And maybe start off with, first of all, just what is ontology?
yeah. So, I mean, I guess ontology is basically deals with being and existence and how philosophy and philosophers have spoken about the idea of existence and being just throughout. And different philosophers have different methods of, I guess, ontology when it comes to um, talking about being and existence. And that's a simple way of, I guess, understanding it. Because I guess when the word is used, it also, I mean, sometimes it maybe means more than that, right?
How so?
Well, I'm just yeah. Sometimes when I'm just like listening to conversations or something between, and then they'll say they'll use the word ontology, and it seems like it's more than being, and I'm not sure.
Well, I will say that there's a certain set of people in the world, usually of a certain age range, usually of a certain demographic background that like to sound smarter than they are. And so
Yeah.
people gravitate to the term ontology just because they think it sounds smart.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, in a certain way, ontology, I mean, this is true of philosophy in general. One of the things that philosophy does is it takes something that everybody knows
Mhm.
and and basically gives an analysis of how it's possible that people know it, or what's involved in the things that everybody already knows,
Yeah.
right? So, and this is actually a big problem that Deleuze has with the dominant trend in Western philosophy, this idea that there is some body of self-evident knowledge that everybody knows, and that the task of philosophy is just to uncover what is involved or what's entailed in what everybody knows. And what Deleuze is going to want to do eventually, if we ever get to difference and repetition, is replace that idea of what philosophy can be with his own more sort of creative idea. So instead of using philosophy to uncover what is entailed in what everybody knows is, necessarily true or self-evident, he wants to use philosophy to uncover the possibility for what no one has ever thought before, right? Or what no one knows,
Yeah.
right? And so it's a move where a kind of more direct way to say it is that I guess is basically right that most philosophers, although there are plenty of exceptions throughout the history of philosophy, but in general, most people think that the purpose of thinking is to acquire knowledge,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
So that thinking in itself is not a final activity. It reaches its end, it reaches its fulfillment in coming to know something,
Yeah.
right? Certainly from Plato on, Socrates is a little bit more of an interesting question because with Socrates, the oracle at Delphi tells him that he's the wisest person in the land or whatever, and he thinks that that must, well, I mean, it's sacrilege to say that the oracle is wrong, but he couldn't believe that it could be true that Socrates should be the wisest, and he goes around asking everybody, the sages, the blacksmiths, and the artisans, and everybody has a certain amount of knowledge.
Mhm.
But one of the things that they do is for the sages, they often go beyond what they actually know. They sort of speculate about what must be the case, even though they don't really know. In the case of, say, the artisans, they view the entire world through the lens of the craft that they know
Mhm.
and can't conceive of the world in any other way. And the one thing that he understands, which ends up being kind of a trope when you think about Socrates, the reason that he's the wisest is that he alone knows that he doesn't know,
Yeah.
right? So, and that for Socrates is sort of the highest, or it's not exactly the highest sort of wisdom. It's just that given the situation, the world that he's in, most people know less than him because they think they know more than they do, right? And so in these Socratic dialogues, what very often happens is that Socrates will be hanging around and he'll, you know, um, encounter somebody and it'll go to a conversation where he says, what is X? Like, what is justice or what is piety? And they have a conversation where they try to come up with an answer. And Socrates keeps asking, asking, asking. And by the end of the dialogue, what becomes apparent is that nobody can give a definition for the thing that they thought they understood, right? And so there you can say, well, is the Socratic method, is the purpose of the Socratic method the acquiring of knowledge or the acquiring of a sort of, I mean, a sort of humble knowledge, a sort of humility in thinking that maybe the purpose of thought is not acquiring knowledge, but rather just in exploring the complexities of thought and understanding that there perhaps is no end. There is no, final fulfillment of the process of thought itself in, say, the acquisition of knowledge or something like that. But for the most part, most philosophers have thought that, well, why do we think? We think so that we can know.
Right.
And for instance, Aristotle in the Metaphysics, his very first sentence is, all men desire by nature to know.
Mm.
And what Deleuze wants to do is replace that idea of thinking in order to know with an idea of thought as an end in itself. There's some question about whether it's really an end in itself. One way that you could say it is that instead of thinking to know, Deleuze wants to think in order to be creative.
Yeah.
In other words, come up with just new ways of thinking, right? So maybe creativity is the end of thought, or maybe thought when it's unmoored, or when it's sort of freed from the idea that thought exists in order to know, maybe thought then becomes creativity itself, right? So that's kind of the idea. Now you were saying something about how people use the word ontology. Oh yeah, actually, what I wanted to say is this. You know, there's a sense in which ontology, people use that word to sound smart, and people use a lot of terminology to sound smart. But in a certain sense, what Deleuze would say is that ontology is kind of the dumbest question in a way, right? There's an element to it which is like it's such a basic question, right? Most philosophical questions are asking about things that are so basic that everyone knows already. That it's a little strange to think of um, philosophy as a sort of oh, I don't know, sophisticated kind of knowledge, right? Or sophisticated sort of enterprise or activity, right? A way to ask the question, what is being, an analogy to that, which I often use when I talk to people about Heidegger and his approach to the question, what is being, is that what Heidegger wants to do in asking that question is sort of like trying to see your own eyes from the inside, right? There's a sense that, being, the question of what is being is the question, what does everything have in common?
Yeah.
Right? We have no trouble making distinctions between, say, a computer and a coffee cup and a tree out there. But to the extent that these are all things in our awareness, maybe objects of our knowledge, what do they all have in common? In fact, if you took opposites, right, things like, if you took opposites like whatever, an object that is white and another object that is not white,
Mhm.
and maybe the only relevant property of the first object, maybe it's just some freely floating mass of white, and then there's some freely floating mass of something that is not white. What do
Mhm.
they have in common? Well, they both are,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And so that's the question that ontology is trying to ask. What is this sort of common feature that underlies everything, the existence of everything, right?
Mhm.
Um, yeah, and that's the question that Bergson and Deleuze are both asking. Now, so that knocks out the question of what is ontology, but then there's the question that came up: what is Bergson's ontology? And I gave you sort of a hint that it's a process ontology versus a substance ontology. So what's going on there? You want
Yes.
to try that? And then Justin, I want you to ask Sandesh two or three questions about what he says.
So, okay, let's when it comes to substance ontology, let's say it's basically say that the world is made of objects.
Oh, let's just try to let's not introduce new vocabulary, right? Substance and object don't mean the same thing.
Yeah.
So let's just stick with substance. Let's maybe even just try to get a working definition of what substance is.
Yeah. Okay, so if I just, I don't know, take this coaster. Um,
Here's a way to start. Substance is a Latin word. It's from a Latin root. The The Greek is hypokaimenon, which means basically the same thing. It's like a direct translation. But I think it should be clear for English speakers what substance means literally. What
Mm.
is substance?
I don't know if I know the etymology. Well, sub is like to subsume something, right?
Oh, no, no. You know how your office is in the sub basement?
Uh-huh.
Or what is the sub? What work is the sub doing when I say sub basement or when I say submarine or whatever? Whenever I use that word sub, what work is it doing? What's it telling me?
Something that's underneath.
Yeah, it's under. Yeah. And then stance should be obvious. What does stance mean?
Taking a stance is like um yeah, something that's like fixed or
Yeah, yeah, right. So a stance could be this idea of not moving but standing, right? It's actually interesting there's a cognate in German which is stehen, and stehen it has more of the sense of not changing. Like for instance, one word for exist in German is bestehen,
hmm,
Bestand. So like a stand is like a sort of static condition.
mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's a state.
Yeah.
Right. So all of those are related to this idea of stance. So there's this understanding of some kind of unmoving situation that is under what exists. So a theory of being, a theory of what is the common feature that everything that exists has have yes have no everything that exists. So it's a singular. What is the common feature that everything that exists has? Well, it's substance. In other words, there's some unchanging aspect that is underneath the things as they exist as different objects, different things, right?
Mhm.
Okay. Yeah. Uh, so now you can start to introduce things like objects and things and whatever you want.
Yeah.
I don't remember if it's clear to you what the difference between, or if you remember what the difference between object and substance is. It doesn't really matter that much. Maybe Justin, you could ask Sandish a question at this point.
Yeah, so well, my question was going to, I think, be the next thing about the process ontology, but I
Well,
guess if
here's the way that you ask questions, right? In philosophy, try to take everything that we say as literally as possible, as literally as possible. If you ever use this technique in regular conversations, people get really pissed off. And they'll appeal to like the spirit of a convention or whatever. But what we want to do right now is be really, really precise and really literal. And so like one literal question that just pops into my mind is, what the hell does it mean for something to stand under a thing that I experience? What does that even mean? I mean, in a literal sense, what does it mean? Right? That would be the sort of question you might want to ask. And you can use that question if you want, or you can come up with another question. But
well, yeah, I mean,
try not
there's
to
the
introduce
physical,
anything. Try not to introduce anything new yet. Just try to ask questions about what we've said so far.
does the positioning of something as being under uh have significance when we talk about substance?
What do you think, Sandesh?
Yeah. I think it does, and I think that's what differentiates between an object and a substance, because you're trying to get at something underneath the representation, um,
Mhm.
and you're trying to ask the question, well, yeah, I mean, I see this object to me the way it's presented, but what is it that is um, bringing this object, or what is it that's like driving this object, I guess.
Driving it?
yeah, driving it or
Hmm. Well, I'd be very careful there because that's not quite right. I'll I'll use some logical terminology, and hopefully it'll be clear why that's not right. To say that something's driving it seems to suggest that it's a sufficient condition
Mhm.
for the thing.
Mm.
So, if you want to analyze the identity, like if you ever look at a dictionary definition, right? What a dictionary definition is supposed to do is give so individually necessary and jointly sufficient conditions. So for instance, what that's supposed to say is the necessary conditions are what must be in place for something to be possible.
Yeah.
What the sufficient conditions denote or enable is the following. If the sufficient conditions are met, you just have the thing.
Mm.
So like for instance, can you give me a, let's see, let me choose something really simple. Like, okay, what's a necessary condition for a thing to count as a dog? Not a sufficient, we only want a necessary condition, right? What's a necessary condition for something to count as a dog?
Okay, so you're saying when you say count as a dog, do you mean like for it to appear like
Is this a dog?
Okay,
Is this a dog?
no.
Oh, so it doesn't count as a dog? I thought it counted as a dog. So now I need to know why it doesn't count as a dog.
Right. Okay.
Okay, so what is something that must be there? In other words, what's a necessary condition for something to count as a dog?
Um, well, I think our knowledge of it, because I wouldn't know that it's, well, because we're already saying dog.
Okay, check it out. What I'm actually asking you is if you're going to write a dictionary
Uh-huh.
and you're going to come up with some definition for the word dog, you got the word dog and you got the definition. What would you say defines dog? This is open to you too, Justin. We all know what dogs are, so.
Could you say it belongs to the species of canines?
Well, that would be a sufficient condition
Okay.
because if it belongs to canine, then it's a dog. There's nothing that belongs to canine that is not a dog. So that's a sufficient condition. But what's a necessary condition that is itself not sufficient for dog?
That it must exist or
Yeah, that's true, I guess. That's a tricky question. It depends on whether we think existence is a property or if it's just mere exemplification. We've had that conversation before. So let's not worry about existence because that gets a little trickier. Let's just talk about concepts
Mhm.
that underpin the concept dog. Okay, so Justin, you're on the right track. Just go up the phylogenetic chain a little bit.
That it's an animal?
Yeah, that it's an animal.
Mhm.
And being an animal is a necessary condition for being a dog, but it's not a sufficient condition, right? Because all dogs are animals, but not all animals are dogs.
Oh, okay. I see.
However, all canines are dogs and all dogs are canines, right? So that's being a canine is a sufficient condition for being a dog. So yeah, that's what we're talking about. And so we're asking the question about, well, what is substance? And if I say that substance drives the existence of objects, I'm not sure exactly what that means. I don't think that's exactly how you said it either, because if I just say it drives the existence of objects, it doesn't immediately suggest that it's a sufficient condition. But the point is that, substance, the being of a thing as substance is taken to be a necessary condition for everything that exists. Right? But substance itself is not a sufficient condition for the differentiation of things because everything is a substance, right? But we want to know what is the relationship between substance and things?
Mhm.
Right? So substance is some way that things are, that all things share, but it's not sufficient to go just straight from a substance to know what the thing is that is predicated on being a substance. So,
Right.
because everything on the substance ontological view, everything that exists is a substance.
Yes.
So substance is this kind of static being under or static standing under things. Now we know that things are different, right? We have a bunch of different things, and even one thing, like my body is one thing, but it's not static, right? So what's the relationship between substance and things as they appear to us in our actual experience? Given that substance somehow, quote unquote, stands under, and this idea of standing is allied with this idea of stasis, what is the relationship then to things as they exist, or things as we experience them as changing, et cetera, and substance? And I'm not asking you to introduce any new insight. I'm really just asking you to paraphrase what I said in a really precise and succinct way.
Yeah, if you took you thought about it like in a hierarchical way, I guess you have substance on top, and then when you divide substance into a new category, then you get, let's say, species or whatever else. And when you divide substance, difference, I guess, like between like whatever new categories you get, you cannot talk about it in terms of substance. It has to be different in terms of what it is or kind, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Sub- uh, yeah. So what?
Yeah, here's a more that was good. That was a paraphrase. It just wasn't succinct.
Yeah.
You want to try paraphrasing what I said? Maybe the relationship between substance and things in our actual experience is changing, and yet somehow still the things they are. What's going on there? Can you say that in a sentence or so, Justin?
Probably not. um,
Okay, maybe I'll just do it since time is short. We only have an hour, and all of this is kind of introduction anyway. Here's what you could say. Things change, right? Our experiences of constantly of motion, of change, of development, etc. We experience not only the world outside our heads as being in time, we also experience our own consciousness as being in time. And since that's true, how could we ever have a concept of things at all? If what I mean by a thing is that it has an identity, right? In other words, to the extent that I can talk about any object or any concept or whatever, there's got to be a thing that I'm talking about, even if it changes from moment to moment, right? So one way of describing the view of substance ontology is just that in order to talk about change at all, you also have to posit persistence through change. A substance is that which persists through change, right? Here's a way of saying it. If I want to say my body, I don't know. It sounds like it's a middle school health class when I start talking about my body. If I want to say the tree outside my window is starting to, oh, I don't know, during the summer, it started to dry out and the leaves started to fall away and it got a lot more brittle. And I'm not sure if it's going to recover even with all the rain, but I do see a few new sprouts of needles coming out of it and so on. And so I can say that the tree is changing. It looked like it might be dying. It looks like it's maybe coming back into health, etc. That's only possible if I'm positing a tree that's changing. Because otherwise, what I have is I can't even talk about change without positing some kind of persistence that accepts the change. Right? That persistence that accepts the change is the substance. The way Aristotle says it is substance is that which can accept contradictories. So in other words, I have this cup and it's blue, and then I could paint it some other color, and now it's not blue, but it's still the cup that's not blue, even though it used to be blue. Blue and not blue are contradictories, right? And yet we would think that just logically, to say a thing can be both blue and not blue would just be a contradiction. How is it possible? Well, it's possible because it's in time. It used to be blue and now it's not blue. But in order for that to be registered as a change, you have to also posit something underneath the change that doesn't change.
Mhm.
That's the identity of the thing that can accept the otherwise contradictory predicates.
Yeah.
Right? So that's what's going on in substance ontology. It's this idea basically that what underlies our experience of the world as changing is this sense of something not changing, right? Either it's a logical postulate, or in another way, this idea that substance has noun identity. In other words, a substance is a noun. Change, if you want to think about it in as proper a way as possible, proper meaning change understood changingly, you would have to say that change is like a verb of some, right? It's a verb. But the idea is that logically nouns underlie verbs, right? So, Sandish, I've said that a lot to you so far. Maybe you can now summarize this idea. What's the relationship between a substance ontology and the priority, the logical priority or the primacy or the ontological weight given to things, nouns over verbs? Can you summarize any of the things we've talked about in that regard?
Just now, or just like
Well, over the last like 2 weeks since we talked
Uh,
about it.
so I think even just when you simply put it in terms of the cup, right? You said it was blue, and then it is now not blue or whatever, and
Mhm.
it is always persisting, even in like language,
The itness, the thingness of it is the substance,
right?
which the substance, the substantial, the fact that there can be a thing that accepts those change isn't enough to say, oh, it's a cup. So it's not a sufficient condition. It is a necessary condition. But it's not just a necessary condition for the thing to exist in our awareness as a thing. It's a necessary condition also for us to even have a concept of change,
Mm-hmm.
right? So without the idea of stasis of some sort, you no longer have change. All you have is moment, 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 right? But I've said this many times that if I like to use the example from the parts of speech, right? We tend, because of the structure of language, we tend to, in fact, substantialize things. That's an actual linguistic term. To substantialize something is if I say, "Oh, I'm talking about this thing," it's called eating.
Mm-hmm.
That's a substantialization of a verb, right? But if I want to say, um, someone asks me what's going on in my room, and I say, among other things, among other processes or whatever, cupping is happening. That doesn't seem right. It seems like it's grammatically ill-formed or something, right? Like, well, it's not okay. I guess you can talk about that way, but it seems to violate the idea that in order to have a concept at all, you have to have this sort of register of unchanging substances. The basic way to say it, the really succinct way to say it, is that as parts of speech, verbs are nouns, right?
Mm.
What's a verb? You look up the definition in a dictionary, verb, and right next to it, it'll have a little N next to it. Verb is a noun. But you
Mm.
never look up as far as I know, there are no languages where um, that might not be right. There may be indigenous languages somewhere in the Amazon that aren't well studied, but certainly Indo-European languages all take nouns as logically prior to verbs. And the idea that a noun could actually be a verb is taken to somehow be contrary to the logic of language. But we don't really have so much trouble thinking about that, right? It's not hard to think of everything as existing as a verb. After all, I mean, just from the view of particle physics, this looks solid, but in fact, it's actually mostly empty space and a bunch of particles moving around. And what are the particles? They're actually just expressions of energy. And in fact, all matter can be thought of as a conversion of energy. If you think about like the famous formula E equals mc squared, energy equals mass times the speed of light squared. Well, the mass is supposed to be a measure of its matter, but matter, when it's moving fast enough, just is energy, right? So you can see that matter itself, on the view of fundamental physics, is taken to simply be an expression of energy. Well, what is energy except pure verbiness, right? Yeah, so that's kind of the picture that we're dealing with here. There's the still dominant view and traditional view that if you want to have a concept of change at all, you have to posit unchanging substances that sort of gather all that change up into a thing. But at the same time, we have no trouble thinking of things as actually being some sort of emergent property or some sort of crystallization of underlying fields of energy interacting, right? And so Bergson's ontology is this of the second sort. And this is where you get this idea of process ontology, right? That what exists most fundamentally aren't substances that gather change up into things. What exists, the things that we call things are actually just snapshots of underlying processes, essentially, right?
Right. So substance is, or let's say identity is like post in process ontology. Like identity or substance arises out of process.
Yeah, exactly right. It's posterior to it. Yeah. Yeah, and it's kind of interesting, we tend to use spatial metaphors for lots of things. When we talk about music, very often high and low notes, but also when you talk about logic, very often spatial metaphors are at work as well. And this kind of goes to your question, Justin, about what work is this sub doing? Is it significant that that is a spatial term, right? And it is significant. There's a sort of, according to Bergson anyway, there's a sort of illicit assumption in the history of Western philosophy and in most, at least Indo-European languages, that space is somehow the more relevant metaphor to use about thinking. And so, it's interesting that even to say so that something is prior or posterior to is not, first and foremost, a temporal metaphor, because it actually originally means in front of or behind, right? And so, there's a sort of corollary to the substance thinking that takes space to somehow be the more ontologically prior way of formulating experience. It's the more sort of quote unquote natural or immediate metaphor that gets used to talk about logical relationships, even though all of these thinkers, well, Aristotle's kind of special, but certainly Plato and anybody that comes from the sort of Platonic lineage will say that, well, logic, these sorts of relationships, ideals, universals, etc., they're not spatial or temporal, yet they constantly use spatial metaphors to describe them, right? And so that's another thing where Bergson is going to want to say that we should try to shift from thinking of space as the more descriptive metaphor to talking about time. As still, though, I think a metaphor. It's not exactly that time is. It's not just that experience, memory, thinking, understanding, etc., are just time itself, right? Time is still sort of a metaphor, but if we start to think about not identities as ways of cutting up homogeneous space, if we think of what exists as a flow of time, that will get closer to the kind of idea that he's bringing up. Here's one more way to describe the commitment that traditional philosophy has to space as a metaphor. So I've said a few things, and you might want to keep a list going of there's sort of binaries at work here, and there are terms that are on one side of the binary and terms that are on the other side. So we've got substance and we've got process. We've got space and we've got time, and we've got quantity and we've got quality. Okay, so you've got process, time, quality, substance, space, quantity. Now, let's say that you have two objects that are qualitatively identical. In other words, they share all and only the exact same properties, right? Both of them have exactly the same properties, and neither of them has extra properties in addition to that. It's just exactly the same qualitatively, right? Nonetheless, you are permitted to say that they're not identical as long as they are quantitatively distinct.
Yeah.
How would they be quantitatively distinct? Well, they'd be separate in space.
Yeah.
Right? Something like that. So that's another way of describing the way that the idea of space underwrites the idea of identities as distinct, even if they're qualitatively identical. Right? So that the spatialization of experience is a way of describing the cutting up of experience into sort of juxtaposed identities. They're juxtaposed because they're distinct in space. But if you think about the way that identities unfold in time, one of the things that you'll find is that they're not juxtaposed. So, for instance, I mean, it doesn't matter. I could even take the stupid example of the cup, right? Let's say over the process of 13 billion years or so, this cup gradually changes from blue to white. Okay. If I were to ask you, okay, so we've got situation one, blue, situation two, white, but it's a constant, continuous process from white to blue. And if I were to ask you, what is the moment at which it's no longer white and it is now blue, you wouldn't be able to give an answer because there is no juxtaposition. There's just complete continuity. If you think of the property of this thing as temporal instead of spatial, right? That's kind of a weird example because I was talking about a predicate of this cup. I could have even said, okay, so let's imagine that this cup gradually forms out of energy flows or whatever over the course of 13.5 billion years. And then I would ask, okay, at some point, finally, this cup, this thing that we can see as an object and call a cup exists. But if I were to ask you, what was the moment that it went from being, particles, which are expressions of energy, et cetera, not the cup, and yet at some point it is the cup. What's the exact delimiting point that happens? You wouldn't be able to give an answer. right? That's the idea, that if you think of identities in terms of time instead of in terms of space, you can have distinction. That is, it used to be blue and now it's white, or it used to be nothing in particular and now it's a cup, but you don't have juxtaposition, right? So you have continuity and heterogeneity if you think about identities in terms of time, right? And that's a big distinction, because in space, we have distinction through juxtaposition, right? A thing is separate from another thing just in case it's not attached to it, or it occupies some other coordinate of space. But let me just summarize it one last time. With time, you do have the distinction because the thing is changing, and yet you could talk about the temporal coordinates, but the thing is that the temporal coordinates are always attached. They're always continuous, right? So you don't have that sort of juxtaposition. Anyway, Sanish, do you want to say something?
Yeah, when you say juxtaposition, and you're talking about two different objects,
Yeah.
what's getting juxtaposed?
The spatial location of those objects, the fact that they aren't continuous from one to the next.
Oh, okay. So do you think Bergson would cite more towards like Leibniz or Newton? Like, there was an argument between Newton and
Yeah, as regards to the calculus, right? But what in particular are you asking?
Newton thought that space is absolute,
Yeah, I see.
and Leibniz thought no, it's relative.
Relative, right? Yeah. Let me think about that for a moment. I mean, it's interesting because Bergson, I don't know Bergson well enough to know if he has an opinion that will contradict what I'm saying, but I do know that he talks about space as essentially an abstract homogeneous medium. Seems a lot more Newtonian than Leibnizian. That, where it's not the idea that space is a way of sort of abstracting from objects, or it is not sort of like a way of attributing a sort of property that's in relation to objects. It's sort of this homogeneous background within which we fit objects, right? But the thing is that Bergson, I think, cites the Newtonian understanding of space in order to discredit it, right? So, but I'm not, so maybe that makes him closer to Leibniz, although I don't think so. I think he'd say in both cases, there's something wrong going on, because space is taken as this fundamental metaphor for analyzing reality, or analyzing the identity conditions of distinct objects, or this kind of thing. I mean, I do know with Leibniz, so there's Leibniz's law, which is it's called the identity. So there are two forms of it. There's the identity of indiscernibles and the indiscernibility of identities. And the idea is that if two objects have exactly the same properties, then they're the same object. But among those properties is spatial location.
Yeah.
Right. So if two objects have all the same properties and they're in two distinct locations, they don't have all the same properties. Right. So it is still this idea that in order to get to an identity, you have to think spatially in order to kind of silo it, to cut it up, or to divide it from everything else, everything that it's not. And what Bergson is going to want to say is that way of thinking about reality, it's not totally wrong, because Bergson wants to think about heterogeneity, difference, but in a way that doesn't cut things up. Right? He wants to think about what exists as distinct but not dichotomous. And Justin, this is an idea that I talked to you about. The difference between a distinction and a dichotomy. Do you remember what's going on there?
Yeah, that well, it sort of gets back to what we were talking about earlier today, that you can have something you can define something that has changes to it as being the same, but dichotomy is talking about opposites.
Yeah, exactly. This really strong division between things versus saying that things are different and yet connected could be a distinction. Whereas a dichotomy would say they're different and separate, right? And Bergson and Deleuze after him as well want to be on the side of difference understood as continuity and not as a sort of abstract division of the world into identities, into things, right? Yeah, I think that that's a good background for process ontology. We don't have a lot of time. We should probably, if we really want to get through this stuff, maybe meet once a week for an hour instead of once every 2 weeks.
I can also meet earlier if
Meet earlier. Yeah,
ready. That's okay.
that's fine with me. I get up pretty early. If we wanted to, I don't know how early you're talking.
I mean, I can be ready as early as 8.
Yeah, eight would be fine for me. We could just meet every Monday at 8.
Yeah.
Something like that. Yeah. Because the next trick will be to talk about Bergson's method of intuition. I'll give you a little clue. Basically, there are 3 steps. Well, Deleuze kind of adds sort of corollaries to 2 of the steps. So it's either 3 steps or 5 steps. But the 3 basic steps are more or less as follows. The first step is to stop the habit of thinking in terms of space. What did I say? Substance, space. What was the third thing that I had? I asked you to write it down, so it should be in your note. What? Quantity. Yeah. Stop thinking in terms of essentially in terms of identities as the basic atomic or the ontologically fundamental way of describing reality. Stop thinking in terms of that and start thinking in terms of time, process, quality, difference. And that's going to require a sort of leap because that's at the axiomatic stage. One thing you could say is that, well, Bergson has demonstrated that it's possible to think process as ontologically fundamental, but he hasn't shown that it's necessary. In other words, it's still possible to think of substance as ontologically fundamental. And so you have what Derrida would then call a pair of impossibilities, where we don't have any rule or any demonstration that would make us choose one or the other. What we'll have to say is, how do you want to see the world? And given how you want to see the world, what ontology do you have to accept as true? Right. But in any case, there's sort of a leap from this substance way of thinking to process way of thinking ontologically. The second step is then once you move from substance to process, stop thinking of process as a thing. So it's sort of like a continuation of the first one, but it's to think now. Stop thinking of process as a thing is to start thinking in terms of continuous heterogeneity or continuous distinction, continuous difference. So you have difference, you have distinction, you have division, but it's also continuous. And then the third step in the method is then to take the fact that now we can think of the distinctions in the world in terms of continuity, apply that metric to the old problems of philosophy, the problems of determining necessary and sufficient conditions in order to get a definition, right? These sorts of things, and look at where they go wrong. So Plato has this method that he calls the principle of division. He has it in a few different dialogues. In the Phaedrus, it's one place that he talks about it a lot, and it's basically given a genus, right? So we were talking about dogs. Given the genus, well, They didn't have the concept mammal. So let's just say animal. Given the genus animal, how do you get to the species human versus the species dog? Well, there are going to be certain ways of dividing up animal. In other words, certain predicates, divisions that you apply to animal and it spits out the species. So if you apply rational, if you divide all animals by rationality, according to Plato and Aristotle, then you get human, right? And what Bergson is going to say is that that goes wrong, not because division is somehow a bad thing, but simply because it's this sort of cutting up into identities. And so then what he'll want to do is take what we've learned about time and continuous heterogeneity and then look at where Plato's reasoning goes wrong. What enables us to say that dogs and humans are distinct and yet somehow continuous with each other? That's the third trick. And the answer is going to be that it has to do with memory and the continuity of perception and so on. But once you understand that stuff, you'll have basically the entirety, or at least like the groundwork for that first chapter of Bergsonism.
Okay.
And then the next step from that is to look at all the extra stuff that Deleuze adds on. That's kind of a foreshadowing for what he's going to do in difference and repetition. Sound good?
Yeah, thank you.
All right. See you next time. 8 next week.
Yeah.
8 o'clock. Yeah. Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.